The fall of the Tans. In a far-flung corner of the galaxy, the Tans had once been known as the architects of peace and prosperity. A young race, they had built their society on the bedrock of science, commerce, and the arts. Their minds were keen, their hearts open, and their culture rich with innovation. They had created a world where knowledge and creativity flowed freely, where there was always room for new ideas, and where cooperation reigned supreme. The Tans had discovered faster-than-light travel relatively early in their development. The stars, once distant points of light, now became their neighbors, accessible through the vast network of space highways they had created. It wasn't long before they encountered other species. The first of these were not much different from themselves, young, curious, and eager to explore. They quickly became allies, forming the core of what would become the United Races Federation. The Tans were the leaders of this coalition, their advanced technologies and peaceful ways making them natural guides to the less advanced races they encountered. Commerce flourished within the Federation. Goods and knowledge flowed from one planet to another. With each new discovery, the Tans advanced in their scientific endeavors. They developed medicine that extended life, energy sources that could sustain entire civilizations, and technologies that allowed for the exploration of distant stars. There were no wars, no conflicts, only the occasional diplomatic wrangle that was swiftly solved with words, not weapons. Yet, as the Federation grew, the Tans began to venture farther out into the galaxy. Their desire for exploration was boundless, and their thirst for knowledge never quenched. They met new races, some peaceful, others not so much. But the Tans, always confident in their ability to broker peace, continued to expand their federation, inviting all who came to join. There were disagreements here and there, but they were resolved with patience and diplomacy, never with violence. Then, one fateful day, the Tans encountered the Sulf. They had no idea that their world was about to be thrown into chaos. The Sulf were a race unlike any the Tans had ever encountered. They were large, muscular beings with an appetite for domination. Their culture revolved around hunting, conquering, and consuming those they saw as weaker. The Sulf did not understand peace. They did not seek cooperation. They saw the galaxy as a vast hunting ground, with each new race a potential prey. When the Sulf first appeared at the edge of the Tans' territory, there was no sign of hostility. The Tans, ever hopeful, thought they could build another diplomatic relationship, another peaceful alliance. They welcomed the Sulf with open arms, offering technology and knowledge in exchange for peace. The Sulf, however, had no interest in peace. They were predators, and the Tans, weak and naive, were their prey. The first encounter was a disaster. The Tans attempted to speak to the Sulf, to reason with them, but the Sulf only saw weakness in their gestures. They did not respond to diplomacy. Instead, they turned their weapons on the Tans' fleet, destroying ships and forcing the Tans to retreat. The Tans, unprepared for such aggression, were caught off guard. Their ships were no match for the advanced weaponry the Sulf possessed. The diplomat, a young Tans who had only just begun his work with the Federation's translation unit, was among those who witnessed the slaughter. He had been trained in the delicate art of communication, in the subtlety of words that could turn enemies into allies. But as the Sulf rampaged across the Tans' fleet, tearing through ships like paper, he realized that words alone would not save them. The Tans attempted to negotiate, to form some sort of truce. They tried to reason with the Sulf, offering them trade routes, resources, anything they could think of to avoid the bloodshed. But the Sulf laughed at their offers, their voices like the rasp of sharpened claws against stone. The Sulf saw the Tans as weaklings, benevolent, but weak, and their only response was violence. In a matter of weeks, the Tans' peaceful federation was torn asunder. The Sulf came in waves, overwhelming the Tans' forces with sheer might and brutality. The Tans, who had always believed in the power of words, now found themselves powerless. The diplomat, forced into service by the Sulf, watched in horror as his people were enslaved. The once proud cities of the Tans fell silent, their inhabitants taken away in chains. Entire generations of knowledge were wiped out in the blink of an eye, as the Sulth pillaged and stole what they could. The Tans' advanced technologies, once the hallmark of their civilization, were stripped away and repurposed by the Sulth for their own gain. The most talented of the Tans were captured and forced to work for the Sulth, building the tools of oppression and war. The diplomat was no different from the others. His job was simple: calibrate the translation devices the Sulth used to communicate with the new species they conquered. He was forced to ensure that the Sulth's demands for unconditional surrender were understood clearly. He sat in the cold, sterile chambers of the Sulth flagship, watching as the Sulth decimated another race, reducing it to ashes. He had seen it happen over and over again. He had seen the slaughter of entire civilizations, the cries of the innocent, the helplessness of those who had no choice but to comply. For nearly 2 decades, the diplomat had lived in this hell. His spirit had broken. The Tans, once so proud, had become mere shadows of themselves, their minds bent to the will of their captors. He had lost hope that there would ever be an end to this suffering. But then, one day, things began to change. It was subtle at first, a whisper among the Sulth crews, a rumor circulating through the ranks. The diplomat overheard something that caught his attention. The Sulth were nervous. They had encountered a race that was unlike any they had ever seen before. A race that had stood against them, pushed them back. A race that had defied them. It was the Terran, and for the first time in years, the diplomat allowed himself a sliver of hope. The Sulth, the most feared conquerors in the galaxy, had been defeated, at least temporarily. The diplomat's curiosity was piqued. Could this be the beginning of the end for the Sulth Empire? Could these Terran be the ones to finally stand against the tide of destruction that had consumed the Tans and every other race the Sulth had encountered? As the diplomat's ship sped toward the Terran's home system, he knew one thing for certain: the galaxy was about to change. The Tan's suffering had gone on long enough. And perhaps, just perhaps, the Terran could be the key to turning the tide. The arrival of the Terran. As the fleet of Sulth ships neared the Terran system, the diplomat found himself consumed by a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. The Tans had always believed in the power of diplomacy, in the quiet strength of words and negotiation. For the first time, however, he was faced with something different. A race that had withstood the might of the Sulth Empire. A race that had dared to defy them. The Terran had not bowed down or submitted when the Sulth first arrived on their doorstep. Instead, they had fought back with an intensity and tenacity that had sent shockwaves through the Empire. This was no longer just a diplomatic mission. It was a potential turning point in the history of the galaxy. The diplomat's heart beat faster as he sat in the quiet of his console, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The Sulth had never been pushed back before, and yet the Terran had done the impossible. They had driven the Sulth Imperial First Army from their world, a feat no one had ever thought possible. For the first time in 20 years, the diplomat allowed himself to imagine a future where the Sulth Empire no longer reigned supreme, a future where his people, and others, could once again be free. The Sulth captain, standing at the helm of the flagship, was not as hopeful. His eyes narrowed as the Terran ships appeared on the sensors, their massive forms filling the viewports of the Sulth fleet. The Terran ships were unlike anything the Sulth had ever seen, huge, imposing, and bristling with weapons. They were a far cry from the sleek, efficient designs of the Sulth warships. These ships were built for one thing: battle. The Sulth captain growled in frustration as he glanced over at the diplomat, who had been assigned the task of preparing the translation device for the upcoming peace talks. The captain's eyes flicked over to the vast Terran armada, which seemed to stretch endlessly across the stars. The diplomat could feel the tension in the air, the growing unease among the Sulth crew. The Empire had never encountered a race like this, and it made them nervous. "Get the translator ready," the captain snapped, his voice tight with worry. "We need to convey peace, and I don't want any misunderstandings. These Terran are not like the others." The diplomat nodded silently, already beginning his work on the translation machine. He had been trained for this task for years, but this situation felt different. The usual process of calibrating the machine to communicate the Sulth's demands, terms of surrender, unconditional submission, now seemed inadequate. The Sulth wanted peace, yes, but their definition of peace was always skewed toward dominance. Would the Terran accept peace on the Sulth's terms, or would they see through the false offers of cooperation and demand something more? As the fleet moved closer to the Terran system, the diplomat worked tirelessly, scanning the data from the Terran's communication networks. He had received all the information the Sulth had managed to hack from the Terran systems, and it was clear that the Terran were not a people to be underestimated. They were a proud and fiercely independent species, with a military prowess that rivaled anything the Sulth had ever seen. The Terran were not afraid of the Sulth. The diplomat could sense it in every piece of intercepted communication, every strategic movement. They had already repelled the first wave of Sulth invaders, pushing them back with a ferocity that stunned even the most battle-hardened Sulth warriors. It was becoming increasingly clear to the diplomat that the Terran were not simply defending their territory. They were preparing for a full-scale war. They were ready for a fight. The more the diplomat learned about the Terran, the more he realized that the Sulth's usual tactics of conquest would not work on them. The Sulth relied on overwhelming force and fear, but the Terran were not intimidated by the threat of violence. They had fought, bled, and sacrificed to protect their way of life, and they would not surrender easily. The diplomat could only wonder how the Sulth would react when faced with a species that not only resisted them, but did so successfully. As the diplomat continued to work on the translator, his thoughts drifted to the people of his own race, the Tans. He remembered their vibrant cities, their peaceful ways, and the beauty of their culture, now all reduced to ruins. The Tans had once been the shining example of what cooperation and unity could achieve, but now they were little more than slaves, broken and defeated. The diplomat's heart ached for his people, but now there was hope. The Terran had shown that resistance was possible. Perhaps, just perhaps, the tides of war were shifting. When the fleet finally arrived at the edge of the Terran system, the diplomat could feel the anticipation hanging in the air. He had heard the rumors, whispered among the Sulth crew, about the Terran's strength. They had faced the Imperial First Army and pushed them back. Now they would face the might of the combined forces of the Sulth Empire. The diplomat knew that this encounter would be like no other. It could either mark the beginning of a new chapter for the galaxy, or the final nail in the coffin for all the conquered races. The Sulth fleet was massive, but the Terran armada dwarfed it. Thousands of ships, ranging in size from sleek fighter crafts to enormous capital ships, filled the sky. The diplomat stood at the helm, watching the Terran ships come into view. They were a magnificent sight, their hulls gleaming in the light of distant stars. They were a people who knew how to fight, and they had built their ships to reflect that. The Terran had been preparing for this moment for a long time, and now they were ready. The diplomat couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. These were not the same helpless, terrified species that the Sulth had easily conquered in the past. The Terran were strong, unified, and resolute, and for the first time in years, the diplomat felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. But hope, he knew, was a fragile thing. The Sulth captain, who had been watching the Terran ships with narrowed eyes, barked orders at his crew, preparing them for what was to come. The diplomat knew that the Sulth were not used to being on the defensive. They had always been the predators, the ones who struck first and claimed victory. But in the face of the Terran, they were uncertain, even afraid. The diplomat could feel the tension in the air. The time for peace talks was drawing near, but the diplomat couldn't shake the feeling that this was not going to be a simple negotiation. The fate of the galaxy, perhaps even the fate of his own people, hung in the balance. The diplomat's dilemma. As the Sulth fleet moved into position near the Terran system, the diplomat found himself locked in a spiral of conflicting emotions. For so long, he had served as a tool of the Sulth Empire. calibrating translation devices, delivering their demands for surrender, and watching as new worlds fell under their cruel grip. His people, the Tans, had been among the first to fall, and the diplomat knew what it was like to watch his world burn. He had seen his people enslaved, broken by the unrelenting force of the Sulf. But now, for the first time in 2 decades, he felt something different stir within him, a flicker of hope. The Terran, the ones who had repelled the Imperial First Army, were unlike any species the Sulf had encountered before. The diplomat knew that the Sulf's usual methods of conquest, overwhelming force, brutality, and fear, would not work here. The Terran had faced the Sulf before and had emerged victorious. The diplomat's mind raced as he considered the implications of this encounter. Could this be the end of the Sulf's reign of terror? Could the Terran finally be the force that would break the chains of oppression that had bound so many species, including the Tans? As he prepared the translator for the upcoming peace talks, the diplomat couldn't help but wonder how much of the Sulf's fear was simply bravado. They had underestimated the Terran before, and now they were unsure of how to approach them. The Terran were not only powerful, they were also intelligent. Their technology was on par with the Sulf, and they had developed their own unique methods of warfare. The diplomat had read the intercepted data from the Terran's network, and what he had found was nothing short of astonishing. The Terran were a proud people, and they were ready to fight for their survival. The Sulf, on the other hand, had never been challenged in this way. They were accustomed to wiping out entire civilizations with ease. They had never had to negotiate from a position of weakness, and they were ill-prepared for a situation like this. The diplomat, who had spent his entire career serving the Sulf, knew that they would never give up their pursuit of dominance. But he also knew that if the Sulf pressed too hard, if they tried to push the Terran too far, the consequences would be catastrophic. As the peace delegation prepared to leave the Sulf flagship, the diplomat couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The Sulf had ordered him to calibrate the translator to facilitate a peaceful resolution, but the diplomat knew that the true nature of the Sulf Empire was anything but peaceful. The translator would ensure that the Terran heard the Sulf's offer for peace, but the diplomat also knew that the Sulf were not above deception. They would use the translator to manipulate the situation in their favor, to convince the Terran to accept a ceasefire long enough for the Sulf to regroup and then strike again. The diplomat's thoughts were interrupted as he entered the command deck. The Sulf captain was already there, barking orders to his crew. The diplomat's heart sank as he observed the tense atmosphere among the Sulf. There was a palpable sense of fear in the air, fear that had never been present before. The captain's usual bravado had been replaced with something far more dangerous: caution. "How long until we arrive?" The captain growled at one of his officers. 10 minutes, sir," the officer replied. "We are in range of their fleet." The captain turned to the diplomat. "You will be ready to transmit our terms, correct? We need to make them understand that we are offering peace, not war." The diplomat nodded, his fingers brushing over the familiar keys of the translator device. "It will be ready," he said, his voice betraying none of the anxiety that churned inside him. He had calibrated hundreds of translators in his career, but this mission felt different. He knew that the Sulf's usual tactics would not work here. The Terran were too strong, too determined to simply bend to the will of the Sulf. The diplomat could only hope that the peace talks would succeed, but in his heart, he feared that the Sulf's true intentions would eventually be revealed. The fleet arrived at the designated meeting point, a neutral zone just beyond the Terran's borders. As the Sulf ships positioned themselves for the upcoming talks, the diplomat's eyes flicked over the view screen. There, in the distance, he saw the first of the Terran ships, a massive warship, its hull gleaming in the cold light of the stars. The Terran fleet was formidable, much larger than the diplomat had imagined. The ships were built for combat, their sleek designs reinforced with layers of armor and weapons. It was clear that the Terran had been preparing for war, and they were not going to be intimidated by the Sulf. The diplomat couldn't help but marvel at the Terran ships. The craftsmanship was unlike anything the Sulf had ever encountered. These ships were designed not just to endure, but to dominate. The diplomat's mind raced as he considered the implications. The Sulth had always prided themselves on their superior technology, but here was a species that had developed their own methods of warfare, their own way of life, and their own sense of honor. The Terran were not conquerors, but they were fierce defenders of their people, and they would not submit to the Sulth's demands. As the delegation prepared to board the shuttle that would take them to the Terran flagship, the diplomat took a deep breath. This was it, the moment of truth. He had no idea how the Terran would respond to the Sulth's offer of peace. He had no idea if they would accept it, or if they would see through the Sulth's lies. But one thing was certain. The galaxy was at a crossroads. If the peace talks failed, it would mean war. And if the Sulth Empire was forced to retreat, it would mark the beginning of a new era where the oppressed races of the galaxy could finally rise up and take control of their own destinies. The shuttle doors closed, and the diplomat was plunged into darkness. His thoughts raced as the shuttle zoomed toward the Terran flagship. Was this the beginning of a new dawn, or the last chance for the Sulth to maintain their hold on the galaxy? The diplomat didn't know, but he was about to find out. The meeting of Titans. The shuttle doors hissed open, revealing a world completely different from the sterile corridors of the Sulth flagship. The diplomat stepped into the heart of the Terran flagship, a vessel so grand it seemed to dwarf the Sulth's ships in every respect. The walls were not the cold, metallic surfaces of the Sulth warships. Instead, they were adorned with murals of battles fought and victories won, their designs intricate and bold, full of life and energy. It was clear to the diplomat that this was a ship built by a people who valued strength, but also honor. This was no sterile war machine. This was the embodiment of the Terran spirit. The diplomat's heart beat faster as he stepped into the briefing room. The Terran delegation stood waiting for them, tall, broad-shouldered, and exuding an air of confidence and power. Their presence was immediately intimidating, not because of any overt aggression, but because of the quiet, controlled energy they radiated. They weren't afraid. They didn't need to be. The Sulth were the ones who should be trembling, and the diplomat couldn't help but notice that it was the Sulth who had their heads bowed as they entered the room. The diplomat took his place beside the Sulth captain, clutching the translator device, now a symbol of his forced servitude. He knew that his task was clear: to facilitate the conversation, to ensure that the Sulth could present their offer of peace, and to hope that the Terran would be reasonable. But in the back of his mind, a new thought began to form. What if the Terran saw through the Sulth's false offer? What if they knew, just as he did, that the Sulth were lying, that peace was not their true goal? The Terran ambassador, a tall figure with sharp features and eyes that seemed to pierce through the diplomat, stepped forward. Her voice was calm, but there was an underlying strength in her words that made the diplomat's heart race. "We've been expecting you," she said, her gaze sweeping across the Sulth delegation. "But before we begin, I must ask, why should we trust anything you say?" The Sulth captain shifted uncomfortably. For the first time since the diplomat had met him, the captain seemed unsure of himself. The fear in his eyes was palpable, and the diplomat felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't the confident, menacing Sulth leader who had once ruled the battlefield. This was a man who was facing something he didn't understand. "We offer peace," the captain said, his voice grating. "We have no wish to continue this conflict. Our empire is vast, but we have seen the strength of your people. We are willing to negotiate." The Terran ambassador's eyes narrowed. Peace, or is it simply another tactic to regroup and strike again? The diplomat swallowed hard. This was the question he had been fearing. The Terran were not fooled. They had known from the moment the Sulth fleet entered their system that this wasn't about peace. It was about survival. The Sulth had underestimated the Terran, and now they were paying the price. The diplomat could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. This meeting, these words, would either mark the beginning of a new era of cooperation, or they would ignite a war that would consume everything. "We are offering you a truce," the Sulf captain continued, trying to regain control. "No more fighting. We respect your strength, and we wish to avoid further bloodshed. Our demands are simple. Cease all military actions against the Sulf Empire, and we will withdraw our forces. In exchange, we will provide you with resources, technology, and resources." The Terran ambassador interrupted, her voice filled with disbelief. "You think we are like those you've conquered before, weak, dependent on your so-called resources. You are offering us nothing but more control, more manipulation. You think that by throwing a few crumbs at us, we will bow to your will." The Sulf captain flinched at her words, and for a moment, the diplomat felt a surge of pity for the captain. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable, but it wasn't just fear of the Terran. It was fear of what the diplomat knew. The Sulf Empire was beginning to unravel. The Terran were the first race to stand up to them and succeed, and now others would follow. This moment was crucial, and the diplomat knew it was his responsibility to navigate the next few minutes carefully. The Terran ambassador turned toward the diplomat. Her gaze was piercing, as if she could see straight through him. "And you," she said, her voice lowering to a near whisper, "you are the one who carries their words. You are the one who translates their lies. Do you believe their promises of peace?" The diplomat was stunned by the question. In all his years of serving the Sulf, he had never once been questioned in such a way. His role had always been one of submission, calibrating devices, translating threats, and ensuring that the Sulf's demands were understood. But now, faced with the Terran ambassador's direct inquiry, he was forced to confront his own feelings, his own doubts. The Sulf had destroyed his people. They had destroyed everything he had ever known. And now they were asking him to facilitate the lies they had fed to so many others. For a moment, he stood silent, struggling to find his voice. And then, unexpectedly, the words came. They weren't the words of a translator or a diplomat. They were the words of someone who had been silenced for far too long. "The Sulf do not offer peace," the diplomat said, his voice surprisingly steady. "They offer survival for themselves. They offer you nothing but a temporary reprieve, and in return, they will strip away everything that makes you who you are. The peace they offer is only a mask for their hunger, their need to conquer." The room fell silent. Every eye in the room turned to him, and for the first time in years, the diplomat felt as though he was standing on solid ground. It wasn't the ground of the Sulf Empire, and it wasn't the ground of the Tan's shattered world. It was something new, something uncertain, but it was his own. The Terran ambassador studied him for a long moment, her eyes never leaving his. And then, to the diplomat's surprise, she nodded slowly, as if understanding. "You are right," she said quietly. "We have fought for our survival for too long to be fooled by empty promises, but there is something we do not yet understand. Why are you still here? You are not one of them, are you?" The diplomat's heart hammered in his chest. This was it, the moment of truth. Would the Terran believe him? Would they see the Sulf for what they truly were? "I am not one of them," the diplomat said, his voice unwavering. "I was born a Tan's. My people were conquered by the Sulf, and I was forced to serve them. But I have seen enough. I have seen their cruelty, their lies, and I cannot stand by any longer." The Terran ambassador studied him with a calculating gaze before finally speaking. "Then it is time to fight, not with words, but with actions." The diplomat nodded. This was the moment that would change everything. He had helped the Sulf conquer, but now, for the first time, he would be part of the resistance. The Terran had shown him a new path, and now it was his turn to show the galaxy that the oppressed would no longer be silent. The spark of rebellion. The diplomat's heart raced in the silence that followed the Terran ambassador's declaration. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his decisions pressing down on him in a way that had never been so clear. The words he had spoken, no longer as a servant of the Sulf Empire, but as a witness to their cruelty, had changed the course of the conversation. He could feel the shift in the room, as if the very air had thickened with the gravity of what had just transpired. The Sulth captain, who had been watching the exchange in growing frustration, opened his mouth to speak, but was cut off by the Terran ambassador, whose gaze never wavered from the diplomat. "You've made your choice," she said, her voice a mixture of admiration and something else. Respect, perhaps, for the courage it took to stand against the tyranny he had long served. "You are no longer a tool of their oppression. You are one of us now." The diplomat felt a surge of emotions, a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and feelings. He was no longer bound by the chains of his past, no longer just a translator for a regime that had destroyed everything he had known. The Terran had accepted him, not just as a witness, but as an ally. But in the same breath, he also felt the burden of the decision he had made. There was no turning back now. If he was going to join this resistance, he would be committing to something far greater than he had ever imagined. But it wasn't just the Terran that would be affected. His actions had just opened the door to something far more significant. The diplomat knew that his story, his truth, would spread. There would be others like him, others who had suffered under the Sulth Empire's cruelty. And now, more than ever, the universe needed someone to lead them out of the darkness. The Sulth captain, however, was less understanding. His eyes flickered with anger, then narrowed with suspicion. The diplomat could feel the captain's gaze like a weight on his shoulders, but he stood tall, no longer afraid of the man who had once controlled him with nothing more than a glance. The captain, sensing the shift in power, spoke again, his voice cold and calculating. "You think this makes a difference? You are nothing more than a broken tool, a relic of a fallen species. You will never be one of them. You are not strong enough." The diplomat's eyes hardened, and in that moment, something inside him clicked. The Sulth had always seen themselves as the apex predators, unbeatable, unstoppable. But now, in the face of the Terran's unwavering resolve and the diplomat's newfound purpose, their arrogance was beginning to crumble. "You don't understand," the diplomat replied, his voice steady and filled with newfound conviction. "You may be powerful, but strength is not just in force. It's in will. It's in the ability to stand up against tyranny, to rise up when the odds are stacked against you. And that is something you will never understand." The Terran ambassador looked at the diplomat with a nod of approval. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that neither the Sulth captain nor anyone else in the room could ignore. The shift had happened. The balance of power, however slight, had begun to tilt. The diplomat turned to face the Sulth captain, whose face was now twisted in a grimace. He could see the captain's lips curling into a sneer, but there was something else beneath the contempt. Fear. The Sulth captain's authority was slipping, and he knew it. His soldiers, his crew, everyone who had once followed him without question, were now watching him with doubt in their eyes. The foundation that had once made the Sulth so terrifying was crumbling, piece by piece. For the diplomat, this was a moment of reckoning. The Terran were not just fighting to survive, they were fighting to protect everything that the Sulth sought to destroy. The Tans had lost their homes, their families, and their freedom to the Sulth. The diplomat had lived for years under their oppression, too afraid to speak out. But now, standing in the heart of the Terran flagship, he realized that he had a chance to fight back. It wasn't just for the Tans, it was for every species that had been enslaved, every world that had fallen under the weight of the Sulth's brutality. "We will never be free unless we stand together," the diplomat said, his words resonating throughout the room. "The Sulth are nothing but predators, and they will not stop until they've devoured every last one of us. But if we unite, if we fight as one, we can turn the tide. The Terran have shown us what is possible. Now, it's time for the rest of the galaxy to rise." The Terran ambassador stepped forward, her eyes shining with determination. "This is not just about survival. This is about reclaiming what has been lost. It's about freedom. And it's about sending a message to the rest of the galaxy. No one, not even the Sulth, can hold us down forever." The diplomat's chest swelled with pride. This was not just a speech, it was the beginning of something much bigger. The Terran were ready to fight, and now they had a new ally in their corner. It was time to bring the rest of the galaxy into the fold. The Terran ambassador turned to the Sulth captain, her gaze unwavering. "You've had your chance, but now you will face the consequences of your actions. The galaxy is no longer your hunting ground. We will see to it that the Sulth Empire falls, and we will stand together with anyone who shares that goal." The Sulth captain's face twisted with fury, but there was nothing he could do now. The Terran were no longer afraid. They were no longer alone. The diplomat had sparked something inside them, a fire that would spread across the galaxy like wildfire. The resistance had begun. As the Terran ambassador turned to leave, the diplomat knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more battles, more struggles, but now there was hope. The galaxy had been under the Sulth's shadow for too long, and it was time for the light to shine through. The diplomat had found his purpose, and he would see it through to the end. The Sulth Empire would fall, and the galaxy would be free. The rebirth of hope. The diplomat's heart was still racing as he walked away from the conference room. He had made a choice that would change everything. The Sulth were no longer his masters. The Terran had given him a new purpose, a new direction, and as he moved through the Terran flagship, he could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. He had seen the Sulth at their worst, but he had also seen the potential for resistance. The Terran had shown him that it was possible to fight back, to stand tall in the face of an enemy that seemed unstoppable. And now, the diplomat knew that the galaxy was on the brink of a revolution. The Sulth Empire, which had once seemed invincible, was starting to falter. The diplomat had thought, for so long, that he was just a tool, a servant of the Sulth Empire, carrying out their commands without question. But now, as he walked through the bustling halls of the Terran flagship, he realized that he was more than that. He was a symbol of resistance. His defection, his willingness to speak out against the tyranny of the Sulth, was more than just a personal decision. It was a rallying cry for those who had suffered under the Sulth's reign. The Terran were already preparing for the next phase of their campaign. Word had spread throughout the galaxy of their victory against the Imperial First Army, and now other races were beginning to take notice. The diplomat had seen it in the eyes of the Terran officers, their fierce determination to see this fight through to the end. They were no longer just defending their homeworld. They were leading a crusade to free the galaxy from the grip of the Sulth. The diplomat had heard whispers of other resistance groups forming in the outer reaches of the galaxy. The Tans, though broken and scattered, were no longer completely defeated. There were pockets of rebellion, small factions of survivors who had escaped the Sulth's clutches and were now organizing in secret. The diplomat knew that the time was coming when all of these groups would unite. The Sulth were no longer the unstoppable force they had once been. They were crumbling, and the diplomat could feel it in his bones. He had seen how the Sulth operated, how they relied on fear and intimidation to keep their subjects in line. But the Terran had exposed the true weakness of the Sulth, their arrogance. The Sulth had never encountered a race like the Terran before, and now they were struggling to comprehend how to deal with a species that fought back with such unrelenting tenacity. The Terran had shown them that power did not lie solely in the ability to destroy. True power came from the will to survive, to fight for something greater than oneself. As the diplomat continued to walk through the flagship, he was approached by one of the Terran generals. The general was a towering figure, his muscles rippling beneath his uniform. His face was stoic, but there was a glint of approval in his eyes when he saw the diplomat. The general had been one of the key figures in the Terran's victory over the Imperial First Army, and now he had become a leader in the growing resistance. "You have done something no one thought possible," the general said, his voice deep and resonant. "You have shown us that we are not alone. Your defection has given us hope, and that hope will carry us through the darkest times." The diplomat nodded, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He had never seen himself as a hero, never thought that his actions would inspire others. But now, As he looked around at the determination in the eyes of those around him, he realized that this was the beginning of something much bigger than himself. "We are not alone," the diplomat replied, his voice steady. "The Sulf have made us believe that they are invincible. But they are not. Together, we can show them that we will not be their prey." The general smiled, a grim but knowing smile. "You're right. And now, we will take the fight to them." The diplomat had heard rumors of a new strategy forming within the Terran High Command. They were planning to strike at the heart of the Sulf Empire itself, to deal a blow that would cripple their ability to wage war. The Terran had their own fleets, their own technological advancements, and now they had the backing of the resistance movements across the galaxy. It was a daunting task, one that would require every ounce of strength the Terran had, but the diplomat knew that they were up to the challenge. The resistance, once scattered and weak, was now unified under the banner of the Terran. The Sulf Empire, which had once seemed like an unstoppable force, was beginning to fracture. The diplomat had seen the cracks before, when he had witnessed the fear in the Sulf captain's eyes. But now he saw the full extent of the damage. The Sulf were no longer a unified force. Their own soldiers were beginning to question their mission, their leaders, and their very purpose. The diplomat could feel the tide turning. It wasn't just the Terran who had risen up, it was the entire galaxy. The Terran's victory over the Imperial First Army had sparked something deep within the hearts of countless oppressed species. The message was clear. Resistance was not only possible, it was necessary. The galaxy was waking up from its long nightmare, and the Sulf would have to answer for their crimes. That evening, as the diplomat stood on the observation deck of the Terran flagship, looking out at the vast expanse of stars, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. It wasn't the peace of submission, of surrender. It was the peace of knowing that the galaxy was finally beginning to fight back. For so long, he had lived in fear, had watched helplessly as the Sulf destroyed everything he had ever known. But now, there was a chance, a real chance, that the Sulf would fall and that the galaxy would be free. The diplomat's thoughts turned to his people, the Tans. They had lost so much, but they had not been completely defeated. The spark of rebellion had always been there, hidden beneath the weight of oppression. And now it would burst into flames. The Tans would rise again, and this time they would not stand alone. As the diplomat turned away from the stars and made his way back to his quarters, he knew that the next chapter of the galaxy's history was just beginning. The battle would not be easy, and the road ahead would be fraught with danger. But for the first time in years, he was no longer afraid. He had seen what the Terran could do. He had seen the power of unity and defiance. And now, he would do everything in his power to help bring the Sulf Empire to its knees. The final stand. The diplomat stood at the edge of the Terran flagship's command deck, gazing out over the battlefield that would soon unfold. The stars above had never seemed so distant, as if they were watching with quiet anticipation, holding their breath in the face of what was to come. Below, in the dark void of space, the Sulf Empire's vast fleet loomed, a dark storm ready to crash into the heart of the galaxy. The Sulf, once masters of the universe, had underestimated the power of resistance. And now, the final battle was upon them. The Terran had gathered their allies from across the galaxy, resistance groups, defectors, and survivors from worlds long conquered by the Sulf. The fleet that now surrounded the Terran flagship was a patchwork of ships, each carrying the hopes and dreams of oppressed species that had finally found their courage to fight. But it wasn't just numbers that made the Terran fleet so powerful. It was their unwavering will to survive, to reclaim their homes, and to strike a blow that would break the Sulf Empire once and for all. The diplomat felt a strange sense of calm wash over him as he stood there, preparing for the inevitable. His role in this fight was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The Terran had entrusted him with a vital task: to serve as their emissary, to bring the Sulf to the negotiation table, to force them to recognize that their reign of terror was coming to an end. But the diplomat knew that this would not be a simple matter of talking. The Sulf would never bow willingly. They would never give up their power without a fight. The sound of heavy footsteps behind him broke his concentration. He turned to see the Terran general, the same towering figure who had stood beside him during the earlier phases of the campaign. The general's expression was as grim as ever, his eyes sharp and calculating. "It's time," the general said, his voice low and filled with authority. "The Sulf are gathering their forces. We can't afford to wait much longer. We need to strike before they can regroup." The diplomat nodded. He had known this moment would come. The Terran had fought hard for their freedom, and now they were going to take the fight to the heart of the Sulf Empire. The strategy was simple: hit hard, hit fast, and make it clear that this would be the final blow to the Sulf's dominance. It was a risky move, but there was no turning back. If they didn't take the initiative now, the Sulf would only grow stronger, more dangerous, and more entrenched in their power. The diplomat was escorted to the command center, where the leaders of the resistance were already gathered, preparing for the launch of the final offensive. Maps of the Sulf's strongholds flickered on the holographic displays, showing the vast network of planets that the Sulf had conquered over the centuries. It was a sobering sight. But what stood out more than anything was the core of the Sulf Empire, their capital world, a fortress world that had never been touched by outside forces. This was where the heart of the Sulf's power lay. The Terran, the diplomat, and the rest of the resistance knew that if they could strike this world, they would cripple the empire beyond repair. "This is it," the general said, his voice firm. "The Sulf are not invincible. We've seen their weakness, and now we're going to exploit it. We will make them understand that the galaxy no longer belongs to them." The diplomat's heart pounded in his chest as the final battle plans were set in motion. The resistance would split into two main forces. One would strike at the outer Sulf strongholds, distracting their forces and drawing them into an overwhelming battle. The other, the diplomat's fleet, would make a daring run toward the Sulf capital, aiming to breach their defenses and send a clear message that no one was safe from the wrath of the United Galaxy. It was a high-risk gambit, but it was the only option. The Terran had no intention of letting the Sulf retreat, regroup, and strike again. They knew that this would be the decisive confrontation. The universe would either remain in the oppressive grip of the Sulf, or it would be reborn, free, strong, and united. The fleet assembled in formation, and the diplomat's ship was placed at the heart of the strike force. As they prepared to launch, he thought of his people, the Tans, scattered and broken, but not defeated. He thought of all the others who had suffered at the hands of the Sulf, and for the first time, he realized that this wasn't just about his own survival. This was about ensuring that no one else would ever have to live under the yoke of tyranny. This was about the future of the galaxy. The diplomat's role, though seemingly insignificant compared to the enormous task ahead, was critical. He was the key to unlocking the Sulf's final downfall. He was their translator, their former servant, and now he was the messenger of their doom. As the fleet shot through the stars, the diplomat couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come. He had once been a simple tool of the Sulf, calibrating devices and translating their demands for surrender. Now he was part of something much larger, something that transcended his own past. This was the culmination of years of suffering, of oppression, of resistance, and it was happening now. The first wave of battle began with a deafening roar as the resistance ships clashed with the outer defenses of the Sulf Empire. The diplomat's ship maneuvered deftly through the chaos, racing toward the Sulf capital. The battles raged around them, and the diplomat could feel the intensity of the fight escalating. The Terran had brought their full force to bear, and now the Sulf were finally experiencing the full weight of the resistance they had long sought to suppress. The diplomat felt a sharp pang of dread as they neared the Sulf capital. The defenses were formidable, as expected, but there was something else in the air, something that told him the Sulf were not prepared for this kind of resistance. The fear that had begun to creep into their ranks had spread like a virus, and now it was clear that even the mightiest of their warships couldn't save them. The time for domination had ended. "This is it," the general's voice crackled through the comms. "Prepare for the final strike." The diplomat's heart pounded in his chest. He knew this would be the moment that decided everything. He had once been a servant to the Sulth, but now, as they approached their capital, he was no longer just a translator. He was the embodiment of every person, every species that had ever suffered at their hands. He was the voice of rebellion, and it was time for the Sulth Empire to fall. The battle outside the Sulth capital intensified as the Resistance's forces clashed with the remnants of the Sulth fleet. But for the diplomat, the true victory lay in what was coming next. The final strike, the breaking of the Sulth's unshakable control, would change the galaxy forever.